Hello Quest, this is Jonathan coming to you for the Issachar Project week 4, so it's March 16th. And if you haven't seen the other ones, I want to encourage you to go back the last few weeks to see what we've been talking about with the Issachar Project. The Issachar Project comes from this idea in Chronicles where it speaks about the men of Issachar who understood their times and who God was and what it meant for them to live in the world. So we've called it the Issachar Project. And it fits under this idea of Quest Academy, this part of Quest where we want to be investing in our community to help us understand foundational elements of the Bible and a biblical worldview and how it is applicable and applies to our real life for us today. And so this week, we are building on what we jumped into last week. So last week, we talked about worldviews, the way that we look at the world, understand the world, the lenses through which we see and think. And often it may be unconscious, but there's big questions that we all have of where did this world come from? Who is God? What does it mean to be a human being and to live life the way that we're supposed to? What's wrong in this world? How does it get set right? Where is this world ultimately headed? Those are worldview questions, and wondering ultimately, like, how do we live? What does this mean for the steps that we take day to day? And so worldviews, we want to say, what does the Bible have to say? What is a biblical worldview on all of these issues in our world? But we need to understand key elements of the biblical worldview. So with that in mind, today we're jumping into this first idea, the idea of creation. Now, creation comes from last week. We talked about the biblical storyline. That if we really summarized the biblical storyline, we'd say there's kind of 4 parts. There's creation, rebellion, redemption, and restoration. Creation, God created the world. There's rebellion, human beings turned away from God, but God is redeeming it, and he's ultimately bringing it to a place of restoration. Those are kind of 4 elements. Today we're going to talk about creation, and this idea actually has incredible implications for the way that we live our world. So other worldviews, let's say there's a socialist worldview or a communist worldview. What they would say about money is that all money is the state's or should belong to the state. And we live in a capitalist worldview that says all money belongs to you. You have ultimate control over your money. It's yours. You own it. And a biblical worldview would say, hey, it's actually everything in this world is God's. It's God's. He's the one who created it, who owns it all. And you and me are to be responsible stewards of our money. So thinking about just money, that comes from this idea of creation, that God created this world, and that's his role as creator, and we are creation. And so this doctrine is going to have far-reaching implications as we go and unpack other ideas in our world and how this connects with a biblical worldview. So we're going to dive into this idea of creation, but before we do that, I want to just give a quick summary. And then we're going to unpack key ideas from Genesis 1 and 2. In the following weeks, we'll talk about the rebellion and restoration and redeeming work that God is doing. This week, it's just the idea of creation. So I want you to hit pause and go read Genesis 1 and 2, or you can read 3, you can read ahead. But just hit pause real quick and read it because it's going to help us as we come into this moment. So hit pause, read it, then we'll start back up. Okay, so having read Genesis 1 and 2, we have these initial words of the Bible, the first words, in the beginning, God. God is the one who created this world. He was there before creation. He did not have a created element. He has always been, and he's the one who speaks into this world and creates. So in Genesis 1 and 2, I hope as you read it, you probably picked up on just these key ideas that there is a God who created the world just by speaking. And it's famous, it's over 7 days. And God creates spaces in days 1, 2, 3, and then he fills those spaces in days 4, 5, and 6. Created the land, the sea, the sky, and he fills those with creatures to inhabit it. And at each point he says, and it is good. And then on day 6, he creates man. He creates human beings. And man is created as this pinnacle of creation, made in his image, the only part of creation that is uniquely image-bearing, men and women in the creation of God. And that's day 6, and then day 7, there's God resting. So as you read Genesis 1 and 2, in those key ideas, we see this idea of God dwelling with his people. That's That's what this world is all about. He is the creator of it, and he made a special place, a unique place for you and for me as human beings to inhabit his world where he would walk with his people. And so it's kind of this idea of a temple, of God's presence with his people. And yet human beings also are supposed to build, to expand, to work, to push out the garden, to take over to fill the whole world with God's goodness and justice and mercy, and to build. And so human beings have this unique spot of being kind of priestly and kingly. We are the ones who reflect God into this world. And yet we sadly turn away from that in the next few chapters, and we'll unpack that as we go, this messy part of rebellion and human beings betraying the Creator and then making gods and worshiping whatever they want and worshiping creation, and there's this rupture that comes. But we're just going to take this foundational idea of creation, of God creating the world and what this means. So when you read Genesis 1 and 2, let's talk just kind of real quick summary over these first few verses. In Genesis 1, you probably noticed there's a very different feel from Genesis 2. And so what we have when Moses wrote this, at least we think it's Moses who wrote this, he presented kind of two complementary pictures. So there's Genesis 1, it actually goes through chapter 2, verse 3. And it is this big picture overview of the creation work of God. And it's a very ordered, structured, on the first day, God did this and created this, and it was good. And day 2, day 3, and it was good. And there's just these repeating refrains, and it's very ordered and structured. And then Genesis 2 is kind of this snapshot expanded of the creation of human beings and their role, and God's walking with them and what it means. And so it's expanded out day 6. So these two kind of fit together, but they emphasize different parts of what it means for God to be the creator. So what we see in this picture of Genesis 1, we see an emphasis on God being transcendent. He's otherly, he is powerful, he is the one who just by speaking creates the world. And then saying, and it's good. There's this transcendence, power, majesty of who God is and his power, and how that just kind of shapes like our awe and worship and who he is. And we see that running through Genesis 1. And then we see an emphasis in Genesis 2 especially, but we see both at play in both Genesis 1 and 2. In chapter 2, it's this idea of his immanence, which is kind of a big word for presence, his intimate relationship and connection of working in this world. God gets his hands dirty. He gets them in the dirt to form Adam and to create and to build. God gets dirt under his fingernails because he is involved in creating this world, sustaining this world, his purposes. Now, we want to hit pause real quick, because when we read these accounts, we come with a lot of modern questions like, how did all of this work and what's the science behind it? And there's a lot of great resources out there and a lot of work that's been done to kind of unpack what the biblical narrative is saying. But Moses' intentions, he's writing to a different audience, to the Exodus community who have been delivered by Yahweh, delivered from Egypt and slavery, and they're asking different questions. They have different assumptions. They're wondering, who is the Lord, and is he able to save us, and how do we live, and what does it mean to be followers of the Lord? And they have different questions, and they have all these other ideas of God. And so Genesis, it has a different emphasis. It doesn't necessarily always answer all the questions we bring to the text, but it is emphasizing a lot of the why, the purpose of who God is and why he's doing this and what it means for our place in the world. And so there's just a different emphasis and intention with what we often come to the text and read. So when Moses is writing this, he's emphasizing these pictures of who God is and our purpose and his work in this world. And we see that in Genesis 1 and 2, his transcendence and his immanence. He is otherly, he's totally distinct from creation, but he is also intimately involved. He's infinite and he's personal, right? Those are kind of key ideas that come with his nearness, his immanence, and his bigness, his transcendence. So if we kind of want to look at Genesis 1 and 2, and actually it's expanded in all sorts of other parts of the Bible, there are kind of key themes, and I just want to highlight 6 key ideas that come from the creation account that inform the biblical worldview and everything we're going to say from beyond this. And so just kind of, this is not exhaustive, but it's just some key elements that are spotlighted in Genesis 1 and 2. So first, it's the idea of the creator and creation distinction. God is independent from this world. This world is dependent upon him. God is not the same thing as the created world. So other religions, other worldviews will maybe intertwine. They'll say he is connected to nature in our world. And the biblical worldview says, no, God is distinct. He is other. There's creation and there's creator, and they are not the same thing. They are distinct. And yet, at the same time, God is totally involved. So there's other worldviews, we call them deist worldviews, that say there is a God, but he's disengaged. He created the world and then sat back and just kind of let it run loose, and just is totally disengaged. The biblical worldview says, no, God created it and he is involved. But there's creation and creator. They're distinct. They're not meshed together, but they are connected, in that God upholds, sustains, and governs this world. He's the creator. Now, the next kind of key idea that is emphasized is the goodness of creation, the goodness of this created world, which first comes from the goodness of the creator, right? God, he creates, and each thing he says, and it was good. The world, the things that he made it, he said, and it is good. And it says it repeatedly through Genesis 1 and 2. And the only thing that is said it is not good is that man is alone. First, when he created Adam, he said, it is not good that he is alone, because this image bearing, this reflecting of God in his world is not enough for man to do. This requires men and women together to uniquely reflect God's purposes. We'll talk about image bearing in a second, but the goodness here, the intrinsic value of our world, is spotlighted by this doctrine of creation, which means that there is inherent value, intrinsic value and worth in our world. So we kind of immediately jump to, environmental protection. That's kind of where this affects kind of a lot of our thinking, and that's part of it. But as Christians, we want to say, well, it's not just protecting the environment or caring about the environment. It's about creation care. It's not just the environment, it's about God's creation, and we care about that. So there's intrinsic value and worth in our world, and we often jump past that to say, and it's fallen, messed up, broken. And that's true, and we feel the effects of that. But I think we need to go back to that at the foundation, this created world, physicality, our bodies, nature. This is good. It's beautiful. It's God's design. There's intrinsic value and worth, goodness of creation. Now, second, I want to talk about, third, we have creation, creator distinction. We have the goodness of creation. And then now I want to speak about especially the goodness, the greatness of human beings. So human beings are created kind of the pinnacle, the crown of creation. They're in day 6, they're at the end, and they're the part of creation, human beings, Adam and Eve, who are uniquely made in the image of God, which I think means a lot of things, but in some ways we resemble God. There's ways that we as human beings have conscience and this element of thinking and feeling and autonomy and understanding of our world, and there's a way that we resemble God in that. But image bearing is not just about we're like God in some way. We have rationality or emotions. No, it's also the idea that we are to reflect God, to reflect his character, his justice, his mercy, his love into this world. We image him, we reflect him like a mirror, and yet we do that fallenly and brokenly now. But by design, God created us to reflect his character into this world. And also is the idea of representation, that God has given human beings responsibility to represent him in this world. So they're given dominion. Human beings have a unique spot. And we are all made in the image of God, human beings, men and women, every one of us. We all come from these initial parents, Adam and Eve. And so there's inherent value and worth of all human beings. There's intrinsic value and worth because of human beings made in the image of God. Now, kind of a next key idea that comes from this doctrine of creation is also that human beings are morally responsible. Because we have this position, we are actually accountable to the Creator for what we do with our lives. There's moral responsibility. There's moral actions that we are required to take to reflect him, resemble him into this world. And we see that is taken very seriously in Genesis 3. Because human beings we're to keep and protect the garden. That's what Adam and Eve were commissioned to do, to keep it, which is the Hebrew word that means to guard. So when there's a snake that comes in, they were supposed to expel the snake. Adam wasn't supposed to let the snake talk to his wife. He was supposed to protect the garden, to say, no, this is God's creation, and I have a responsibility to protect it and to work for his good in this world. But they betray this responsibility, and there's catastrophic effects because of that. So there's moral responsibility. Next, I want to highlight there's an inherent value of the goodness of work, that human beings are created to do things in this world. And that doesn't end just when you retire, and that maybe looks different in different seasons, but doing work in this world, the steps we take to cultivate, to work, to build, to be fruitful and multiply in all sorts of ways in our world, that there's goodness and value to it. Now there's also broken pieces, which we'll talk about later, but there's ultimately value in work. It's not part of the curse. Now it's messed up because of the curse and sin, but there's inherent value in work. And next, there's also a lot to say about the value of God's design for marriage, sexuality, for gender. This is all part of God's good design. That's the last kind of highlight I want to give, is that God created Adam and Eve, male and female, and there is all this to say about marriage and value and purposes for sex, with procreation, but intimacy, and there's a goodness to that. It's not God. Our culture has turned that to God, right? To sexuality, to worship everything for that. But ultimately, though, from a Christian worldview, you want to say, no, this is good, there's a place for it, and here's God's design with marriage or sexuality or maleness and femaleness. And we'll talk more later in the Issachar project about these ideas, but they all come from Genesis 1 and 2 of God's creation and his design for marriage. And so we want to go back to that. So there's goodness to these things. It's goodness to bearing children. But now we also feel the consequences. With all of these different kind of key ideas, they get tainted by the darkness in our world, by human betrayal of the Creator. And so when we think about these six, they're the foundation for the biblical storyline. I want to just read back through these six and encourage you to do two things. First, so here's the six. We said there's goodness of creation. There's the creator-creature distinction. There is human beings as image bearers. Fourth, that human beings are morally responsible. Fifth, that there is inherent value and goodness of work. And sixth, that there's God's design definitions of marriage and sexuality. Those are all found in just these initial opening chapters of Genesis, and they're reinforced through the rest of the Bible. Now, these six, I want you first to think about which one of these, or ones or all of them, which ones are hardest for you to grasp or to believe, or that are most challenging to the way that you view the world. Which ones rub against you that you're like, I don't know about that. Or maybe you have questions about, well, what ones for you hit you that way? And then secondly, I want you to start thinking about where do these maybe conflict with a lot of ideas in our world today? Specifically, we're thinking about an American context, Western context, but which ones maybe are most acceptable, palatable, make sense to our world? Which ones do not? Which ones are more easily rejected or disdained? Where does this challenge our world? So we want to say a biblical worldview, that's our foundation, is this idea of creation. Now we'll talk about everything that builds from this, but as we close, I just want to encourage you that God is the creator and he is faithful to this world. So the amazing thing about the biblical storyline is that it doesn't end with us messing up this place. God is faithfully at work. The Bible is front-loaded. Genesis 1 and 2, it's so important to understand this, because with that we understand the problem in this world, the solution, God's faithfulness to our world, and the redemption he's bringing about. So, as we close, I want to encourage you to rethink back through those questions and keep those in mind as we jump in next week to the idea of rebellion, of sin, the reality of brokenness in our world. That's where we're going to go next. So thank you for joining us for Issachar Project Week 4 and tracking with us on the idea of creation. Stay tuned. We'll have more to come, and have a great week. We love you, Quest, and we will see you soon. Bye.